This episode of Total Network Operations is brought to you by TrustGrid. TrustGrid replaces enterprise VPNs that connect cloud apps to on-prem data sources. It's built for infrastructure teams at SaaS application providers. TrustGrid is software-defined networking that manages networks like SaaS providers manage the cloud. Shift the burden of deploying, maintaining, and supporting cloud-to-edge networks to TrustGrid. Connect third-party data sources from a cloud-native network with enterprise-grade security. With TrustGrid, tunnels configure automatically, patches are applied programmatically, configurations are automatically backed up, and the platform supports new standards like OpenTelemetry. Visit trustgrid.io/packetpushers today to create up to 10 free network connections. Welcome to Total Network Operations, the project with a podcast that's dedicated to hardworking network operators like you who deliver all the packets. I think there's a case here for saying that NetOps folks are the true packet pushers, so to speak. Here on TNOps, we shine a bright light on great ideas in NetOps so you can make informed decisions for your network and your team. I'm your host, Scott Robon. It's my pleasure today to have Chris Grundemann, especially on the interviewee side of the mic for a change. Many of you know Chris from his practical presence in the networking industry. He's been able to do a lot. We'll touch on a good number of projects that he's participated in and led and roles that he's played. Chris and I are business partners in the Network Automation Forum. We'll certainly touch on that at the end of the episode today. But I really want to dig into the lifelong lessons and wisdom that he's learned on NetOps issues. Being business partners in NAF is a great thing, but more importantly, we're friends, and it's an honor and pleasure to have you here today, Chris.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me, Scott. This is great. I'm glad we're doing it.
Yeah, same here. It's been too long. Give us your hero origin story, a little background. How did you get into this gig?
Yeah. So, like I think a bunch of us, at least of our generations, born in, the people born in the late 70s, early 80s, computers were part of my childhood. My dad brought home a Texas Instruments computer when I was pretty young, and I learned to read and to do math while I learned to program BASIC, on this computer in my parents' basement really early on. But my actual career, I kind of fell into it through a circuitous path of low voltage wiring and satellite television, and then ended up at a wireless internet service provider. And shortly after I started there, essentially they let go of the entire technical staff, which was like 2 people. So it wasn't, it wasn't massive. But I ended up really learning trial by fire, like building a WISP while answering check support calls. I was also, hanging off the side of a 1,000-foot tower, hanging an antenna, and then kind of figure out the architecture of the network and figure out how to build it. And we did it all kind of on a shoestring. So it sounds much more glamorous than it is, but we essentially wrote our own router OS. This was a very early 2000s. So it was, before really kind of the, like now we have like Bird and Quagga and Zebra and all these kind of open source routing packages. And I'm fairly certain most of them were not available at all, and definitely wasn't aware of any of them at that time. And so we essentially had a bunch of Perl scripts that were on a couple of Linux servers that set up IP tables, NAT and forwarding rules to create bridging routers at startup. That's how I cut my teeth, and that was where I really kind of got bit by the networking internet bug. And it all kind of snowballed from there. Were you connecting base stations to some kind of core or aggregation network or something like that? Eventually, yeah. So when I first started, basically what they had done was, so again, this was kind of very early 2000s. And so cable internet either wasn't quite a thing or hadn't penetrated anywhere outside of the cities yet. And even like DSL and things like that, like weren't, you couldn't get any kind of high-speed internet outside of a metropolitan area. And so in Colorado, there's a bunch of kind of semi-rural suburbia that kind of spreads out into the mountains, into the woods. And there's a bunch of these communities that, is either dial-up or put an 8-foot HughesNet dish, in your backyard.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of people that just didn't have reliable high-speed internet service at all. And so we would go into these communities and basically find the house on the tallest hill and get a T1 pulled in to them, put an antenna on their roof, and essentially use Wi-Fi to do fixed broadband internet access. And so we put an antenna up on their roof, and we actually had, it was a modified version of Wi-Fi called CarlNet.
I'm not familiar with it. Okay.
Yeah, it was interesting where it actually turned Wi-Fi into a polling algorithm. So it was more, and I forget the exact details, but it treated it more like a circuit switch than packet switch.
Okay.
It kind of like gave like a time slice
to
each based like each house. But anyway, so it would just be a neighborhood home to a single T1 and out to the internet. And then over the course of a couple of years that I worked there and kind of built this out, we did transition over to using wireless links to connect these little pockets back together and actually create kind of a backbone that had bigger pipes draining out. We were actually, we bought the first like fiber Metro Ethernet circuits. We had like circuit 0001 from, I think from, AT&T and another one from TW Telecom.
Okay.
Was two of the first Metro Ethernet circuits that we bought to turn into our wireless Metro Ethernet, as we called it. And then as we were building that, those other internet services started to penetrate out into the rural areas, which kind of wiped out the business model.
Yeah.
And the company pivoted and we started trying to build more of a business focused wireless Ethernet, in the city, and eventually kind of ran out of money and it didn't go much. We built a really cool, like, air fibers, backbone, a big ring around Denver.
Right.
But didn't get much further than that.
But, so all unlicensed spectrum, you didn't have to deal with licenses or anything like that.
Well, so once we pivoted and tried to build the business network in Denver, those were licensed links, the backhaul links.
Okay.
They have these Dragon Wave radios.
So microwave.
Microwave radios.
Yeah.
Which also is wild. That's how I learned that Denver has the most amount of federal buildings outside of Washington, D.C.
I believe it.
Because there's a lot of black zones. You cannot shoot microwave radio over the Federal Reserve, for example.
You can without getting a phone call.
Right.
Yeah.
So we had to like do different frequencies in different parts of town and do some weird shots to get around all the federal buildings.
Right. So, of course, you said you did everything with Perl scripts. So I know, and you've made comments in the past, you've never done a networking project that didn't involve automation of some form.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Some form, right? And pretty rudimentary stuff. But like I said, so that, I kind of started with SDN, I guess. And obviously we didn't call it software defined networking.
Right.
And in some ways, all networking is software defined, right? There's no networking that works without software.
Let's just call it what it is. SDN is a marketing term. And we'll leave it at that. We don't want to, we come to, the dead have been buried at this point.
Yeah.
So,
but I think that is, at least, definitely kind of an automation perspective, right? I mean, we were working with servers and we were building routers out of servers, and doing a lot of work with software directly, right? So directly on Linux devices. And so I kind of learned Linux and networking at the same time, right? And then learned about, the Cisco CLI. And then when I saw Junos, I was like, oh my goodness, this looks just like a Linux CLI.
Right.
It made a lot of sense to me, the way everything's put together. Coming from that Linux background, Junos just made a ton of sense.
Yeah.
And loved it.
Have you ever seen a route server and BGP config in Junos? It's like, this is very familiar.
Yeah. But yeah, so I would consider that kind of, automation essentially, right? There was these scripts that were installing routes and things like that. And then, when the writing was on the wall and like, it was definitely like, a nosedive of funding that we weren't going to recover from.
Sure.
I took a job at a place called Vertella, essentially an MSP.
Right.
And they were more of a Juniper shop. That's where I got exposed to Juniper.
Sure.
And they actually used, I don't know if they would call it automation per se, but they had a really great, like ticketing system, I guess, is essentially what it was, where whoever did, so they were essentially the yes men. Which is true for a lot of MSPs, I guess, but they would basically like, if everyone else told the customer, no, we're not doing that crazy stuff, Vertella would say, yeah, sure, we'll figure it out. And so every customer had a like custom design network. But the designer like built those designs and then the engineer built those configs into the system. So so I worked in the help desk there.
Okay.
Essentially the NOC, the global NOC. And if somebody called in, you could pull up their account and then drill in, and all the documentation was there. So you'd have configs of all the devices. You had the original design docs, like everything was right there. And so you could tell how it was supposed to be working if something had changed. And so, it was more of kind of, I guess, almost like observability style automation, right? Because we're pulling the configs off the devices and that kind of stuff.
Right.
It wasn't as much pushing config automation. But that system kind of really stuck with me. I'm like, okay, there is a way to do this well. Because then many places that, anywhere I've worked with folks after that. Almost no one I've ever seen with a system as good as that one, right? Where you could actually, from the like, tier one help desk, totally understand what the network was supposed to look like, what all the configures are supposed to be. And you could really easily troubleshoot things, which I think is a big, big, big part of operations, at least in my career.
Sure. Yeah. So, up to this point, you obviously did lots of things, including hanging off poles 1,000 feet in the air. Mm-hmm. From an ops perspective, like what impresses you up until this point in your career? Like you were responsible for bringing up customers and keeping them up.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Did you feel that pressure?
Oh yeah. Well, and especially like I said, at what was eventually called WaveMax, we called it Hometown Access. Beginning, that was the WISP. I mean, I was, I was it, and I had no idea what I was doing. So answering a tech support call from somebody when their service is down, we almost just hope that they can reboot their router and everything's fine.
Sure.
And with wireless equipment hanging out of somebody's window, it's reboot the whole package. And usually that works. But when there was a big outage or something, if something actually went wrong, it was terrifying. And I definitely kind of learned how to troubleshoot under pressure. Luckily found that I was pretty good at kind of, reverse engineering, I guess, kind of walking through the steps of troubleshooting. Like, okay, like, can I ping to the gateway? Can I, what that set of things you do to troubleshoot, and remembering to do every step every time so you don't miss something. Right. It was foundational for sure.
And what you called out at Virtela, like being able to collect all the configs was probably really helpful in reasoning through, okay, this is really the state of the network, kind of the source of truth for what's actually configured right now. If you could grab those configs. Okay.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And then I went from Virtela, I went to Time Warner Telecom.
Right. The MSO space.
Yeah. Well, no, so Time Warner Telecom.
Oh, right. Pre-cable. Yeah. Okay.
So this was, so Time Warner Telecom was a joint venture between Time Warner and Quest.
Which the whole industry was confused about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Quest was the local, like,
the RBOC.
Bell.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then Time Warner was Time Warner. And what happened is, right, like, shortly after Time Warner Telecom was created, Time Warner and AOL did their deal.
Sure.
And part of the antitrust shenanigans was that they had to spin Time Warner Telecom out into its own company.
Mm-hmm.
So they were required to boot it out into its own company, which is why it was its own company.
Right.
And it maintained the naming rights for 10 years. And I was there when those 10 years ran out, and they changed the name to TW Telecom.
Right. Okay.
Which no longer stood for anything.
Yeah. No, and I was always confused about that. So thank you for that clarity. Yeah. I remember seeing the change from the outside.
Yeah. Well, and then, of course, TW Telecom got bought by Level 3, which was then bought by CenturyLink, which is now Lumen.
It's all like, there's got to be a great picture out there of how we went from all the little independent telcos 100 and however many years ago through the Bell system, the RBOX, and the devolution. And we'll find, maybe we'll write that picture.
Yeah.
So
we have breaking AT&T apart and then pulling it all back together.
Yep, exactly.
Almost.
I served in my piece of that system in Bell Atlantic, around the same time. And your DSL comments, like I remember early DSL in the DC suburbs, 97, 98. Like I was the fourth DSL customer off my CO in Springfield, Virginia at that time. So
cool.
Let's pivot a little bit. You've been involved in internet exchanges,
yes.
IXs. So many folks listening know what an IX is, but some don't. Like what's an IX and how did you get involved in that community?
Yeah, I would argue that most folks listening probably don't actually know what an IX is. I mean, you make it conceptually right, but it's
don't we make no assumptions.
It's very, on one level, very simple, but in some way very abstract. And so I think even me working as a telco and cable co engineer for a long time didn't totally get it until I actually founded one and built one.
Denver IX.
Yeah. IX Denver.
IX Denver. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. We paid attention to acronyms there.
Right.
So it's IX Denver. And, although there is now a Denver IX, who kind of stole our logo and, whatever.
Yeah. But the simple version.
It's the simple version. So an IX is a switch. Right. And what makes that switch special is that it's a switch that multiple different autonomous systems connect to. And so the job of the Internet Exchange as an organization is to operate this switch, essentially. And then there's this whole, if you read like the Dr. Peering book, he separates IX from IXP. In common parlance, no one actually does that. But the idea there is that like the internet exchange is the switch and the internet exchange point is the building that the switch is in.
Okay.
Now, no one actually uses those words that way.
Sure.
Although there is kind of a resurgence of that lately, where there's a company out there that's kind of using those terms that way and separating it out.
Okay.
It's fine. Maybe it may be technically accurate that way. But common parlance is to kind of use IX or IXP interchangeably. And so anyway, autonomous systems are discrete networks that have a autonomous system number and they run BGP. Yep. And so they just connect to this switch and then they can all connect to each other using BGP over the switch. And so it's an interconnection point where traditionally it was mostly focused on service providers, right? ISPs and especially kind of your tier 2, tier 3 ISPs. In many cases, it's better for them to exchange traffic with each other than to pay AT&T or Verizon to exchange that traffic between them.
Right.
It makes it, traditionally it was cheaper. That may or may not be the case anymore. Transit prices have gone down drastically over the last 10, 20 years.
Okay.
And so now the cost benefit, the pure dollars and cents is not as clear as it used to be. But it does make the internet more resilient, more robust, theoretically smaller, right? You can reduce latency if you're actually interconnecting locally. And now with all the hyperscalers and stuff, these big cloud providers, they're now big players, as well as the content delivery networks. And so again, if you're a smaller ISP and you can connect directly to Amazon and Microsoft and Google and Meta
without Verizon,
without having to pay anybody,
sure.
Like, the internet exchange points or the internet exchange ports are typically fairly cheap and kind of all you can eat. So if you go get a 10 gig port, you have a 10 gig,
yeah.
And usually the port cost is fairly cheap
compared
to transit costs. And so if you really utilize it well, in a lot of cases, you can bring your costs down. But what you've definitely done is connected your subscribers directly to the services they use. And so, a lot of times there's root servers for DNS. They'll connect to the exchanges as well. A lot of folks will put caches at the servers. We're starting to do that now, where we have like a Valve cache. So if you're downloading games on Steam,
right?
There's a cache right on the Internet Exchange. And there's a few others as well. We have a Micromirror for like open source software on the Denver Exchange. So basically it is this interconnection point. And nowadays, usually you also have a route server. And so people could either unilaterally connect BGP to each other, which they negotiate those relationships,
right? Or
they can just connect to the route server, and then everyone who connects to the route server just shares routes. The core kind of open, easy button kind of sharing situation.
So it's a business model, and I don't sense that anybody's getting rich doing this, but you have to be able to operate it. It takes staff. You've got to have some kind of NetOps. There's some functionality there.
Yeah.
And depending how many ports you support, it could be multiple switches that are interconnected in a fabric of some sort, right? So.
Exactly right. Yeah. They can grow and be pretty big or they can be small. And in the US, a lot of the current internet exchanges are nonprofits that are operated by a couple of folks.
Right.
And it can be as simple as a single switch in a data center. So for example, I think there, like a lot, like some of the exchanges in say West Virginia or some of these kind of lower density population areas where it's just a switch in a meeting room in a data center.
Right.
And that's it. In Denver, we are spread across several data centers and have multiple switches in every data center and could you run a full like EVPN, DPLS, mesh over everything.
Sure.
So it's a little more complicated and we actually have some professional staff to operate the network.
But you're paying for those circuits to interconnect, the different physical facilities, right? There's real costs.
For a long time, our policy was if you want IX Denver in your data center, we will provide the switch as long as you provide space, power, cooling for free, and give us transit back to our hub.
Sure.
Which in Denver is 910 Telecom. It's the Denver Gas and Electric Building. It's where all the fiber goes through, for better or worse. And so a lot of the circuits are paid for by the data centers that we operate in. Although that has changed recently. We have started to build out our own backbone. We've got some dark fiber links now, and actually are building out our own backbone.
Cool.
Yeah.
It does seem like there's this, and I'll be careful in saying this, but like the tier ones really want to leverage who they are, right? And they have the most connectivity, and that's why they could command the prices that they did for as long as they did.
Yeah.
And the IXs were, I'm not just going to say are an alternative, But I mean, is that fair? Would you say call them an alternative to?
To some degree. I mean, so not in the sense of either or, right? I would never, I don't think that it makes sense to try to like only have internet exchange connectivity.
Right.
You need a transit link, and probably more than one. But I think that it is a great supplement, right? And so a big part of it is you can keep local traffic local. The more people who are using the local exchange, the more you get that local exchange, and it doesn't have to leave the metro area.
Sure.
Or even the data center in a lot of cases,
right,
to get between, customer, eyeballs and customer, or eyeballs and content, or whatever might be going on there. But it doesn't give you a full table,
right.
Ever. Although I think level 3 was like the most interconnected network for a very, very long time. I don't know if that's still true of Lumen. I don't know how those assets have played out.
Yeah.
I've never run level 3. That was is interesting. Like that's kind of how they became a tier 1, so to speak,
right,
was by peering liberally everywhere they could, which gave them tons of routes on their network and gave them access to everything with very little needed transit. And then there's also arguments around like the whole, like, what's tier 1, tier 2,
right.
What does all that mean? But the really big guys in this next, they get smaller as they go down, more regional.
Don't ever call a tier 2 that thinks they're a tier 1, right?
Right.
That's always a dangerous conversation.
Yeah.
Cool. Any particularities about operations in IXs that you could call out?
So like I said, I mean, it seems really simple, right? It's just a layer 2 fabric.
Yeah, but if you run an EVPN across multiple sites, you're starting to get complexity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And even if you're not, what's interesting is because you are this, hub, but not a switching hub, but just a more
interconnection
hub. Yeah. What you're doing is you're connecting to a ton of third parties, right? So you are the fabric over which these sessions happen, which means if, ISP A starts spewing a bunch of MAC addresses into the fabric, like you have to catch that before it takes down the switch or, spreads to everybody else. So there is a level of, there's some interesting like policies you need to kind of make sure that like the ether types are right and that like BPDUs aren't going the wrong way and just a bunch of little switching stuff.
Wow.
But you're dealing with like, multiple different ASs, which I think makes it a little bit more interesting in some cases. And then, what people, spray across or not, and, build loops and that kind of stuff.
It's a microcosm of what it means for internet peering, right?
Yes.
BGP peering. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's like, this is a fundamental construct of how the internet works.
Right.
Right. Yeah, very
Absolutely.
cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to think of them as the knots that tie the internet together.
Sure. That's a great example.
And then, traditionally in the US, if you go back 10 plus years ago, we basically had data center owned IXs.
Okay.
But which is okay, except that what was happening in a lot of cases was you couldn't connect to that IX unless you were in that data center.
I see.
So there's a little bit of like rent seeking that could go on there where they say, okay, well, you have to buy a rack, even if all you want is an IX port. All right.
Right.
And then the cross connect to the IX port, and still a couple of big data center providers still don't provide public pricing of their cross connect fees because they change the price depending on who's asking. Because they want to get the biggest number they can.
Sure.
And a lot of it's exorbitant still. But about 10 years ago, a few folks got together and created OpenIX, which is now rebranded to OIX, which is a standards body that basically says, hey, you should be fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory.
Right.
And so there's an OIX1 standard, which is the standard for how an IX should operate. And basically about this just being, it's more about transparency in your policies.
Sure.
And your pricing. Than anything else, right? It's less technical spec and more kind of operational, like business operational spec to make sure that everything's fair. And then there's an OIX2 standard, which is for data centers, and OIX3, which is for tiny data centers, for edge data centers. But really, then again, those are focused on kind of the policy around interconnection. So do you publish your cross connect prices and that kind of thing? And so folks can certify their IX or their data center and basically say, hey, yes, we are interconnection friendly. You can come here to interconnect freely. And we've seen that since OIX started 10 years ago, the landscape in the US has changed drastically, I think. And that's where now we have all these small independent IXs all over the country, that have really, I think, helped interconnection, globally.
A couple things to pull out there. So much about peering and interconnection is about business model. And it's not router configuration, switch configuration, and technical stuff. And you serve in a board leadership position for OIX?
I'm a chair of the board right now for OIX.
I don't think I congratulated you on that when I saw that. So congratulations.
Yeah. And I was looking for more volunteers and folks. So if you're interested in this stuff, I think coming to OIX and volunteering is a great way to get more into kind of how IXs operate.
That's a great shout out.
That kind of stuff.
Yeah, sure. No, that'll go in the summary on LinkedIn for sure. So why the resurgence? Why the improvement over the last 10 years? More smaller IXs popping up.
Yeah, I mean it's a good question. I think in a lot of ways, some would describe it as like this. There's always this kind of this European model of internet exchanges. So there already was way more internet exchanges in Europe 10 plus years ago.
Sure.
And so some of that kind of bled over. I think OIX itself had a lot to do with it. I mean, honestly, when the folks started OIX, that was a big part of the trigger for us starting IX Denver. We had this idea of IX Denver for a while, and we were just kind of like, well, who are we? Like, we don't really know what we're doing. We're nobodies. Like, why would we? Are we? Like, we joked about starting an IX in Denver, but never did it because it didn't feel like a real thing. Okay. And then OIX came out and said, hey, everyone should be doing this, and you can do it this way. And we said, oh, let's do this. Let's follow through on our idea.
Sure.
And so I think that happened. I think that was inspirational for other folks as well, I assume.
Okay.
So I think that had something to do with it. Yeah. And I think just generally, right, I think internet service and interconnection and, data centers have proliferated. I think just in general, we've just seen more awareness of the need for a robust, resilient, low latency network, for a lot of applications. And so people just found that they needed this and people feel that need.
This episode of Total Network Operations is brought to you by TrustGrid. TrustGrid connects SaaS application providers to their customers' data. TrustGrid is network as a service for applications that rely on customer data connections. Designed for applications running in AWS, Azure, GCP, and private clouds, it replaces enterprise VPNs that connect cloud apps to on-prem data sources. Moving to the cloud while leaving on-prem equipment? TrustGrid helps infrastructure teams that are migrating to the cloud but want to outsource their edge equipment migration. TrustGrid is built and operated by networking people who help NetOps and DevOps teams by shifting the burden of deploying, maintaining, and supporting these networks to TrustGrid. Ditch your next-gen firewalls and routers at customer sites and never terminate IPsec VPNs to customer equipment again. And who doesn't want an IPsec-free life? Are you going to miss IPsec? No, you won't. TrustGrid is the choice for SaaS providers who want someone else to handle the pain of cloud-to-edge network deployments, management, and troubleshooting. With TrustGrid, tunnels configure automatically, patches are applied programmatically, and configurations are automatically backed up. The TrustGrid platform also supports new standards like OpenTelemetry. Visit trustgrid.io/packetpushers today to create up to 10 free network connections. I think this is one of the ideas that, the whole idea of going from circuit switching to packet switching and having autonomous systems and independent organizations and networks that can peer and share information, and there's no controller, there's no internet knock, right? And that's one of the things about SDN that always bothered me. Like, there's always this, urge to we need a controller for this.
Yeah.
And it's like, you need to think about fundamental internet architecture. One of the reasons it's so scalable is it's so flexible and there isn't one single point of failure or point of control.
Yeah.
I'm not completely anti-controller. I know there are some applications where that's really important, but people forget that, I think, pretty frequently. So let's, adjacent to this, let's also touch on your involvement in Internet Society.
Yeah.
So tell me what you did there, and your focus on deployment and operationalization.
Yeah. So that was an interesting kind of road and journey on its own. So as I said, when I started working at WISP, I really kind of got bit by the internet bug and just the possibilities of what the internet was, this thing that we were building, that I was helping build a very small part of, just was really powerful to me. Sure. This idea that, we're basically creating global telepathy. In some ways, right? Like I can shout out into the void and someone in Guangzhou can hear it.
Sure.
At the same, like as I say it, it's wild.
Yeah.
It's not only a library in that there's all this information organized, on there, and you can kind of, that back then it was a little bit harder to find, the information you needed.
Sure.
But it was obvious that there was that power there, but you could also then contribute back.
Right.
You can put your notes out there. So anyway, I got really excited about the internet. And so I started looking into kind of internet governance, I guess. I didn't know that was the term at the time, but just, how does this thing actually operate? And the whole idea, as you were talking about, like this co-opetition, the fact that, competing companies have to work together to make this thing work. Like,
right.
You don't have, like, internet is interconnected, is internetworking.
Has to. Like, you have to cooperate.
Yeah. There is no internet if you don't connect to your competitor. Right. At some level, right? And maybe you get one of them's paying the other one, right? And back to the interconnection stuff. But that's just it's wild to me. It was really interesting. And so I started looking into it, and I stumbled upon the Internet Society, which had a bunch of information around this, and then also was, set up by Vint Cerf, the guy who created TCP/IP.
Yes.
Or, one of the guys. And, Large just thought it was like the grandfather of the internet. And they set up, him and John Postella and a couple others set up the Internet Society in the very early days to promote the internet, to promote the internet protocol, and to make sure that, the internet was for everyone. The Internet Society is also the organizational home of the IETF. So the IETF is not actually an organization, legally. Sure. It's all the money and everything goes through the Internet Society. The Internet Society is going to be the organizing body for that.
Right.
But anyway, the Internet Society also has chapters.
Mm-hmm.
There's local chapters. And I said, there's not one in Colorado. Oh, I guess I'll start one.
Okay.
Then there was a process where I started an Internet Society chapter. And this was one of those things where, like, I had no idea what I was doing. It definitely wasn't the right person to be doing this.
Right.
No one else had done it. So I figured I'll do it. And you had to have, like, a couple of people that were signed on as, like, other, like, board members. And you had to have, like, 25 people signed up as members. And you could fill out this application and create a chapter. So I did. And in doing that, Lindsay Moore, who was the CEO of the Internet Society at the time, reached out to me and was like, hey, this is great. This is really cool. By the way, there's going to be this ARIN meeting, which is the American Registry of Internet Numbers, the regional RIR for English-speaking North America.
RIR?
RIR.
Say it. Define it.
Regional Internet Registry. So that's a whole nother thing.
Where you get addresses from.
Yes, where you get addresses from. So there's IANA, which is the
Internet Assigned Numbers Authority.
That's right. And then there's 5 RIRs. So numbers go out through the 5 RIRs, which there's 5 RIRs, and they're all in different regions. So there's North America, South America, Europe, Africa, and Asia. Anyway, so ARIN is our RIR. And so she said, hey, there's this RIR meeting. The ARIN meeting is going to be in Denver in a couple of months. I'd love to meet you. You can meet, some of the other people, whatever. So through kind of blindly creating this Internet Society chapter, I was then introduced to ARIN. And then the people who were at the ARIN meeting often tags along the end of a NANOG meeting. Right. So I was introduced to NANOG. And that kind of all created a spiral of, like, just general involvement in these things. Yeah. So I ended up becoming an advisory board member for ARIN. I ended up being on the program committee and creating some committees at NANOG. And then the Internet Society, I ran that chapter for a while. And then eventually, I ended up working at the Internet Society, right? Which was the deployment operationalization.
After all these years, it's still hard to say.
Yeah, it's classic Daigleism. Leslie Daigle was the CTO
Sure.
where I got hired, and she had a knack for creating intense, using words that aren't readily used, right? So the operationalization is a real word. Not
it works. Yeah, DNO.
Yeah. So, yes, I was interested. So after I left Cable Labs, and so my job essentially was to fly around the world and talk about technology. And so it was really, again, they kind of focused on operators. Mm-hmm. So part of what I was doing was trying to pull more operator input into the IETF. The IETF, and all the RFCs that are put out, like, traditionally and still today is largely dominated by vendors, which makes sense because the RFC is kind of the standard that your router or switch has to follow.
Right.
So if you're building routers and switches, this is very important to you. If you're using routers and switches, it's important, but possibly not quite as important, depending on how deep you're looking to help.
Can help you understand router OS behavior.
Right.
Yep.
And especially as we get more complicated and more specific in these things, having operator input into that process earlier on is super helpful. But again, it's hard because there's a little bit of disconnect there, right? The operator's not building the OS, but they can influence it.
Right.
But it's just hard to get, like, see that value and have, like, folks at this operator get funded to fly to Berlin to talk about protocols.
Right.
The ROI there is not direct and easy.
Extremely
Anyway,
indirect.
so that was part of it. But also part of it was helping get network operator groups stood up.
Okay.
There's now network operator groups all over the world.
Right.
And so, I was there at like the first Hong Kong NOG, the first Thai NOG, the first Bangladesh NOG meeting, and help kind of get them going, and start exchanging information locally in the way that we do with NOG and RIPE and all that stuff. And then also promoting what Leslie called the broccoli technologies. They're good for you,
but nobody likes them. Yeah. Yes.
So IPv6 and DNSSEC and some of these things that we know we have to do, BGP security,
sure,
and the whole RPKI system.
Yep.
So kind of evangelizing all that and talking about that in all over the world, and then showing people why DNSSEC and TGP security and IPv6 are needed, even if you. And it's another one of those competition things, right? Where like if you deploy IPv6, it doesn't help you until everyone else does it. And so there's like a first mover disadvantage. So convincing people to like, hey, you need to do this. And then once everyone else does it, you'll get benefit, which is, again, not direct ROI.
Sure. There is an interesting theme here where you've been motivated to start something, whether it's an IX, or governance for IXs, helpful governance for IXs, and things like getting network automation forums started. I don't want to go straight to NAF just yet, but like I wanted to pull that out right here while we can. Before we go to automation and that, let's talk on one other big theme. And I'm going to embarrass you a little bit here because like I see you as this really interesting hybrid of you're really grounded in what has to be done to make something work. And you're also a big thinker. Mm-hmm. And like, I'm sure that's been an evolution for you. I hear you talk about the Santa Fe Institute. I know you're going to an MIT event. How has that influenced your thinking? What was your path like there? Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. I mean, it's definitely something that I've striven for. I think, who was it? Somebody talked about like the hedgehog and the fox or something, right? And like one's like the detail orientation versus big picture orientation. I think that came from somewhere. Somebody talked about that.
Yeah, we've had that conversation at some point before.
And you look at somebody like like Thomas Jefferson, right, who was visionary enough to like help structure the foundations of this country, right? This political system that's working 250 years later, whatever it is. But also was detailing like what the flora and fauna of the New World, right? And it was getting really deep into the weeds of like mapping rivers and drawing out flowers in books and like creating these manuscripts of like what life is like. And so that's something that I definitely have always respected and admired in other folks. And so I think it's just something that I've kind of striven for.
Okay.
But I also think that one of my greatest strengths is, well, it's twofold, right? I learn really fast, which is great. And then I synthesize really well. Mm-hmm. And I think that synthesis is what helps, because what I can do is if I load myself up with a bunch of details, I can kind of like see the pattern there, and like the unimportant pieces kind of fall away and the important pieces kind of click together.
Sure.
And I can see the big picture of like what's actually going on here.
That I affirm that from an external view. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, I definitely think that is a strength of yours.
So I think it's just really good at synthesizing. I don't like analyzing quite as much, but synthesizing is great, right? So I can go from the details to the big picture.
Sure.
I mean, it go both ways, I guess, but yeah, I think that's a big part of it. For whatever reason, my brain just kind of works in that way, to kind of see the pattern in the noise.
I would add another important skill that you have, I think that complements everything you just said. You're not easily influenced by trends. Mm. You're willing to say the emperor's not wearing any clothes, right, to overuse that picture. And you're good at going with, well, what does the data say? Even though you say you don't like analysis, you are good enough at analysis and synthesis to say, yeah, I understand this marketing trend or why this is getting headlines, but I don't really see why we should even bother with this.
Right.
And I'd say that's been a strength in NAF without question.
Yeah, thanks, man. No, that makes sense. Yeah, I think, I don't know, I forgot what I was going to say there.
That's okay. Take this, and we're going to go to NAF for the rest of the episode here. Like, you and I have both heard people like John Willis and others talk and emphasize the importance of getting out of your swim lane and understanding what's happening in other pieces of technology and society. How's that important for anybody in an ops role?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think having some context of the business you're working in is super, super valuable. And this is something that I definitely didn't understand early on in my career, for
It's
sure.
at least two of us. Yeah.
I kind of wanted to be left alone and like, let me build the network.
Yep.
And like, none of that, like, leave me alone with that stuff.
Yeah.
But the fact is, if you understand just enough about business in general, which, a little secret, it's just people. And if you understand that, and then you understand what your business does, you can, I think, right. So I think there's this general idea that the more thoroughly you understand a problem, the more elegant a solution you can create.
Right.
And so that problem is bigger than just the technology in a lot of cases.
Right.
And whatever form of technology you work in, there's almost always some business or nonprofit reason for that technology to exist. And if you understand that reason, if you understand what's the bigger thing we're trying to accomplish,
right,
you could probably create a more elegant solution in the technology, right?
Yeah.
And you can stress about the right things and not stress about the things that don't matter, right? There may be errors on the network that don't affect the business that look like big problems to you, and you can freak out. But if you know that it's not actually business impacting, maybe even go back to sleep or whatever, right? Or take your time to work on it,
right?
Versus maybe something that looks minor technologically can sometimes be a huge business impact,
right?
And you can have a rude awakening, literally. If there's a business backing service outage or something like that. So I think that context is helpful.
So that's a perfect lead in to talking about automation and Network Automation Forum. I think with that backdrop, I think we both noticed some LinkedIn chatter in the past few weeks about, the question is, why are you not automating what you're doing?
Yeah.
Right. And if you understand there's a business reason or higher reason for doing what you do, the business isn't about preserving exactly what you do in your career, like having you and I as JNCIEs having memorized lots of Junos commands, right? The businesses that we serve don't exist to perpetuate that.
Right.
That's just a very practical thing that help us do our jobs for a certain time. And markets want to be efficient, right? They seek efficiency, and automation in many industries is a way that, has facilitated that for not just decades, even centuries. Right.
Absolutely.
So how has that thinking, led you to what we're doing in Network Automation Forum? Like, we don't have to do the whole history of NAF because we've covered that lots of times with lots of people.
Sure.
But what are the important points on that part of your journey?
Yeah, well, I mean, to the origin story a little bit, right? I think, coming from the background I did, right, where at WISP, we wrote our own network out of code.
Right.
And then, at Vertella, we had that really great ticketing system that I haven't seen matched anywhere else since then. And then, at TW Telecom, or Time Warner Telecom originally, these two guys, Bill and Jim Sella, were there before me. They were there from the very beginning of the Time Warner Telecom kind of experiment.
Right.
And they built what looks a lot like what we would describe as a modern automation framework 25 years ago, 30 years ago.
Right.
And so anyway, so having seen that, and that's how I learned networking.
Right.
Was through automation. And then I kind of moved over.
I think that's rare. And I think that's rare. I think most people who are in networking did not learn it that way.
Right. Sure. Absolutely. And so, so I learned, I kind of learned automation and then learned the CLI almost.
Sure.
But not quite. Also learned wireless first, and then optical was really weird and scary to me.
But it was awesome.
Yeah. But I think, so that's where that question for me really has deep meaning, and like, why haven't we seen full adoption of automation yet?
Right.
Because, in the service provider world, we were using expect strips at the very least.
Yep.
30 years ago, probably before that even. Then like, why hasn't it spread out, right? So then when I got exposed to more enterprise networking and saw that like there's huge enterprises that aren't even using, the expect scripts, aren't even using,
nothing like it,
Python or anything to do anything. I was just shocked, to some degree.
Yeah.
As when I worked at Myriad and some of that stuff and just got exposed to more and more of that, was wild. And so, I think what I have seen over and over again is when you put smart people together, great things happen.
Yeah.
And so those two pieces, right? Like, okay, wait a minute. Like automation is not happening as fast in the networking world as it is almost everywhere else.
Right.
Like everything else is automated. It's not just technology, right? It's like all kinds of stuff. Is the CRMs are getting automated for salespeople and marketing people and just, everywhere, everything, like you said. And so let's get together and talk about this. And I think just by getting together and talking about it will advance the state of network automation, which really is advancing the state of network operations, which really should just, move everybody forward, right? I really think that we've kind of entered this third phase of networking, right? The first 30 years or so was, can this work?
Check. Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, is TCP IP a viable protocol for an internet?
Right.
Like, is this even a thing?
Yep.
Roughly the next 30 years was, can it work better? Which was, I think, a lot about user experience, right? Like, do I need to unroll a Ethernet patch cable and like plug my computer into the wall and make sure that that's plugged into a switch? Or can I just pull my phone out on a plane and be connected to everything all the time without even noticing it?
Whether you like it or not.
Yeah. Right. And I think that's pretty much solved. Like internet connectivity. I mean, there are definitely areas of the world and areas even of this country that don't have the internet access they should.
Right.
And we're still working on that. And that's a big thing of what the Internet Society does. But in general, technologically speaking, it's a solved problem. Right. We know how to make network connectivity invisible and ubiquitous.
It's a matter of getting the infrastructure in the places that don't have coverage. Right.
So I think we've moved into this third era, which is, so it was, can it work? Can it work better? And now it's, can it work smarter? And what I think we are focused on and should be focused on is the network operator experience. So we made it great for the users. Now let's make it great for the folks who actually run the networks.
Right.
And when I say network operator, I mean the individuals, whether you work at an enterprise or a government or a service provider or a data center, whatever. If you're operating a network, you're a network operator, in my opinion.
Yep.
And I think we need to make your job easier and your life easier, because networks are not getting any less important or any less foundational.
Correct.
And the number of devices isn't going down. The number of bits isn't going down. Like all this stuff is going up. And we just frankly don't have enough people.
Right.
And human error is the biggest cause of network outages.
Yep.
So let's make network operations better. And I think the way to do that is with a lot of automation, orchestration, observability, using these software-based tools outside of the router or switch itself to make the network work better and to make your life operating the network easier.
So I did not tee up that conversation with Chris. You couldn't have described what I'm trying to do with total network operations better, right? We're trying to elevate the role of operations because that's the next place to make things better and smarter, right? Especially as the technologies become ubiquitous, as we're looking on variations of themes in certain protocols and architectures, but a lot of those decisions have been made, right? And now how do I make the role for the individual operator and the NetOps organization, and how the organizations can evolve with the new tooling that they have? So thank you. I couldn't have asked you to say that better. Okay. So look, we have a couple big things coming up in the next few months and the rest of this year. It's, as we record this, it's March 2025. We're getting ready for AutoCon 3 in May 2025 in Prague. How do you feel about how things are coming together?
It's exciting. Yeah, I'm really excited. Yeah. The super early bird tickets sold out in 8 days. The early bird tickets sold out in 8 days. We're still a couple months out, and almost all the sponsorship slots are taken. So we're still seeing that really big, community response to these events, which, is great on a number of levels. And, the event keeps getting bigger and the content keeps getting better, and the conversations, I think, just keep getting deeper. And so I'm excited, to see this kind of thing running. I think Network Automation Forum is the first thing that I've created that really feels bigger than me. And that's really cool.
I agree. I think it's way bigger than the both of us.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And how quickly that happened, where this community kind of took over. And I think if we disappeared, this thing would keep rolling on its own. People would figure it out and keep moving it forward. And that's just really, really cool to see that there is this kind of groundswell of folks who believe that this is what we need to be doing. And they're willing to help each other do it.
And if we talk about the numbers, right, for like the number of talk submissions, what are we at for
115 submissions?
Yeah.
For
20 some slots. Yeah. Yeah. That's incredible. And, it's how do I say this? It's a painfully democratic process, right? The whole board, the advisory board, and you and I go through all of these submissions.
Mm-hmm.
And most, if not all, are awesome.
Yep.
And it's really hard to say no to the ones that don't make the cut, so to speak.
Right.
And if they don't get selected, it's not because it's a bad presentation. There's maybe a theme that's emerged and, these other, 20 some presentations fit the theme better. Right. So really good problem to have, really drives the quality and really, gives us the problem for the next one and the next one and the next one when people want to, hey, I would love to be part of that program too. Absolutely. So that's Prague. For AutoCon 4 in November 2025, we're in a secret location. We're doing TNOps on the road here while we evaluate potential facilities. What do you see differently for AutoCon 4? Either additively or just different way of handling things?
Yeah, I mean, the events are getting bigger, right? I mean, we've the last two sold out max capacity at the venue we had. So we're continually getting bigger and bigger venues. So AC3 is going to be bigger. AC4, we're looking for a spot that could potentially hold up to 1,000 people, which is wild. Coming from just a year and a half ago, we had 345 people show up at the first one. So that's interesting. And then I think, more and more kind of additional activities are getting more formalized around the conference itself, right? So the workshops has been a big boon for folks. I think we're going to continue that. The Birds of a Feather sessions have been really popular, and I think we're going to expand and make those more formal, maybe take them out of the lunch break and move them around, get some different, private rooms and things like that. We're looking at potentially doing a business and leadership track at AutoCon 4, because what we've found in a lot of these conversations is that the technology of automation is almost never the hard part. It's the organizational buy-in, it's the budget, it's the time to actually build the automation so that you can use it later. That's what some of the biggest challenges are. And so we're looking at, how do we help engineers equip themselves to go fight for this, to get the time or the tools or the money or whatever they need to be able to automate the network to make everything better. So helping equip people with those skills is something we're looking at.
Yep. I think that's exciting. There are many ways we can shape it. Again, we'll see what content comes together, through that open admission process and, us coming across people in the communities and the circles that we run in and saying, hey, I think that's a really interesting idea. Maybe it could fit a business and leadership track, or it's a good general session. Why don't you submit a presentation, proposal on that topic? So cool. Well, I can't wait for either event. It's going to be a very busy 2025. It already is. Yeah. I'm now going to ask you the fun questions that everybody gets asked. So when you did maintenance windows, when you actually had to support maintenance windows, what were you a music in the background kind of guy? And what was your favorite music for maintenance windows?
Interesting. So I listen to a lot of electronic music in the background, mainly because it's fast and bassy and there's no lyrics.
Okay.
If I have lyrics going, at some point I end up typing lyrics instead of commands.
Oh, wow.
For some reason, right? It channels through me.
Sure.
And so a lot of time when I'm working in general, I'll listen to, and like I said, if I'm trying to pump up and stay awake at midnight, some techno or some house music.
Okay.
Is usually my go-to. If it's, a stressful maintenance window that's going wrong, that may switch over to some Chopin and put on some piano music. There you go. Everything back down a little bit. Again, with no lyrics being kind of a biggest part of the theme there.
Yeah, no, the cognitive processing, right? If you're I will like a Yo-Yo Ma and cello. There's something magical about cutting through stress. I'm also a huge Vince Guaraldi fan. I love, that's my go-to office music. I also do not support maintenance windows. Not anymore. And then, the other big one is there an outage that you caused that you would like to own up to for the first time publicly on this podcast?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So back in the WISP days, right? Like I said, we had, Linux servers that were serving as our bridging routers for the core of the network. So we had two of these things and everything else just kind of switched. And in the middle of the day, I was doing something. I don't remember what I was doing, but I was updating the scripts on these boxes, and I did a full halt, like a shutdown, on the wrong box. Oops. And it was the master of the pair. And so they actually both shut off. So I basically turned off the core routers for the entire network, like, thousands of subscribers. And because I had done that, they were off. So now there was no remote access. So luckily my office was not that far from the data center.
Got it.
So I pretty immediately realized what was going on, kind of yelled out, there's an outage. I'm going to go to the data center and try and figure it out. Like, ran out of the office, drove down the street, went into the data center, powered everything back on. And of course it came back up and worked fine because it was just turned off.
Sure.
Yeah.
Did you get away with it? Did you own up to it? How did you handle that?
I don't remember. I think I just kind of let it go. Like it was fixed pretty quickly, and I think I just kind of let it roll.
Sure.
I don't know that I ever told the folks there that I had turned everything off. I just said, no, I fixed it. It's good. We're good. Early my career.
What safeguards would you put in place to prevent something like that? Now, from that ops perspective now.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think potentially you even you can limit commands, right? And make it like, like change the sudo file a little bit so you can only run certain commands and you can't actually shut things off. Also, right, like and building in that. I mean, to some degree, you can all at some point with the right access, you can always shoot yourself in the foot.
Right.
And so in a situation like that, where, I was the only employee with technical access, it's hard. What I probably should have done is had multiple roles, even though it was just me. I probably should have had multiple roles anyway.
Right.
So that it's more of a conscious effort to get into the wrong place and be able to have the access to do the wrong thing.
Use the least privileged role that will let you do what you need to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Instead of just full, bazooka, sudo, being able to do everything on the route all the time.
Right.
Which is easy, but leads to potentially, doing exactly what I did.
Yeah. No, so look, we live and we learn, right? We've all done it. So, look, we could talk for much longer. We've gone for about an hour, so we're gonna wind it here.
Yeah.
But you write a lot, you think a lot publicly. Where's the best place for people to go to hear more about what you're saying these days?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is probably where I'm most active as far as kind of social networking, online stuff. So you can find me on LinkedIn or chrisgrundemann.com is my website, which I haven't been blogging as much lately, but like everybody, I hope to be more active in the future.
It's always a struggle, right? It takes work. So awesome. Thanks for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Doc.
Thanks to everybody else for tuning in to Total Network Operations. TNOps is a growing project. We'd love your feedback. If you know someone or you are someone with important things to say about NetOps, please contact us. Spread the word and drop me a DM on LinkedIn or send us a follow-up at packetpushers.net/follow-up. See you next time on Total Network Operations.